The Doctor and the Master, one of the most intricate relationships in the Doctor Who universe. And in 2017, one single action could have changed the dynamic to its very core. In our timeline, Missy was gunned down by her past self before she could stand with her longtime friend. But what if events went differently? What if Missy had stood with the Doctor? Welcome to Doctor Who Alternate History, the show where I determine what things could have been like if events played out just a bit differently. But before we get into it, if you could do me a teeny tiny little favour and click that subscribe button if you haven't already. We're trying to get to 15,000 subscribers, so any support would be greatly appreciated. Now on the surface, this scenario is somewhat simpler than my previous one where I outlined the results of a delayed time warp. As unlike with that timeline, this one is simply the result of a character being able to make a decision that they weren't able to previously. But the fallout of this decision is no less significant. But first, let's discuss how this timeline could come to pass, for which I can see two possible options. The first option is that following the Doctor's speech to the two Masters prior to the Cybermen attack, Missy is fully persuaded by the argument, and while the Sim Master would protest, I think it's possible that the Doctor and Missy could incapacitate the Sim Master, following which he would eventually retreat back to his TARDIS, and the story would carry on as usual. The second option is that when Missy and the Master are alone in the forest towards the end of the episodes, the Master never shoots Missy to prevent her from allying with the Doctor, either because it just doesn't occur to him to do so, or perhaps the more in-character alternative would be that despite him disagreeing strongly with Missy's decision, the Master's need to preserve their own life would override their hatred of the idea of standing with the Doctor. In either case, however, the result is the same, with Missy deciding to stand with the Doctor, meaning that the rest of the episode would play out largely the same, only this time Missy accompanies the Doctor until the very end, meaning that they blow up the floor of the ship with all the Cybermen on it together. Now with all this going on, you may be wondering, what about the Lumiate? For those of you unaware, the Lumiate is a Big Finish audio story where, long story short, Missy gains access to a forbidden piece of Time Lord technology known as an Elysian field, a device that breaks the body of a Time Lord down into its component atoms and allows the reprogramming of their personality whilst destroying their body. This sparked a regeneration in Missy, despite her being at the end of her current regeneration cycle, and gave her a new cycle. Now this does contradict slightly with what's stated in the Doctor Falls, as it's implied that the Master's laser screwdriver blast was the thing that killed Missy's ability to regenerate, rather than her being at the end of her cycle. However, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that the Elysian field allowed Missy to regenerate in spite of the Master's fatal blow, rather than it giving her a new cycle, and seeing as Missy wouldn't get shot in this timeline, this would allow Missy to regenerate alongside the Doctor. I think this would also have a knock-on effect on 12's decision to regenerate, as in the original story the Doctor was very reluctant to regenerate, but perhaps the prospect of continuing to travel with their newly redeemed best friend, something that he had always wanted, would give the Doctor enough of a reason to keep going. As a result, however, the TARDIS likely wouldn't have decided to take the Doctor back to the first Doctor's regeneration, unless the timeline was severely under threat. But seeing as the first Doctor made the decision to regenerate independently before Twice Upon a Time, it is feasible to think that he would make that decision without 12, foregoing the need for that story. However, now is when things get really different, with 12 regenerating into 13 and Missy regenerating into the Dewan Master, because yes, he is after. And although there is possibly incarnations in between, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to go ahead and make it so that they change into the incarnations we are aware of for both the Doctor and the Master. This would mean a pretty big status quo change going into the next period of the show, assuming that the Doctor and Master remain friends of sorts, which I know some people debate should have happened in the main show anyway, but I think it's more likely here given how close they would have been upon death. And plus, if you wanted to try and justify the Master's personality change in Series 12, you could make the case of it being down to the Elysian field, which in this timeline Missy wouldn't have used, but that is admittedly me putting a large bandage over a character inconsistency. In any case though, if we assume that Doctor and Master are now friends, we can assume that the events of Series 11 go relatively the same, only this time with the Master along for the ride as a reluctant member of the TARDIS team, in a similar fashion to how they were in the animated Doctor Who episode Scream of the Shelker, minus the being a robot part. Or to use a more widely known example, similar to what the Doctor proposed at the end of Last of the Time Lords, except this time the Master would be a willing, if highly sarcastic, travelling companion to the Doctor and friends. The real changes, however, come with the advent of Series 12. For instance, if the Master is friends with the Doctor and goes everywhere that she does, it's highly unlikely that the events of Spyfall would have happened at all, given that the Master was the surprise twist villain in that episode with control over the Kasavan. And while it's possible Barton may have come into contact with them without the Master, I think it makes more sense if this adventure doesn't occur. As a result of this though, the Doctor wouldn't have found out about Gallifrey's destruction. In fact, Gallifrey isn't even destroyed in this timeline, but the Doctor and crew, Master included, would still have been warned about the Timeless Child prior to this, in the Ghost Monument, as well as later encountering the Roof Doctor in Fugitive of the Judoon, June. So it's possible in this timeline that the Doctor and Master would head to Gallifrey for answers, likely without the other companions, as assumedly the Doctor is still very secretive about her past towards them, upon which they discover the revelation together. Now in terms of the pair's reaction to the news, it's hard to say. Seeing as the Doctor and Master would now have been friends for a long time at this point, I highly doubt the Master would become enraged at the idea of the Doctor being part of their origin. If anything, I'd imagine they'd want justice for their friend and would be willing to do anything to obtain it, while perhaps the Doctor would wish to do it more diplomatically. And if you're wondering what would happen to the Cybermen in this timeline, then I'd imagine the Doctor and crew would defeat them without them heading to Gallifrey and becoming the Cybermasters, as that was a suggestion of the Master in our timeline which he wouldn't have made for obvious reasons. Honestly, this timeline could continue into flux and beyond, as while the change starts small, it alters a central dynamic in the show moving forward. But I have to cap it off somewhere, and this seems like a natural place to stop. But feel free to leave your suggestions as to where this timeline could go in the comments section below. Like this video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one. Shout out to Debs Iona, Shane Smith, Ree Keffin, Seb Lowndes, Jay Monroe, Hash Shandycoot, Patrick Mewson, Simon Ashley, Steve Safaro, Andrew Townsend, Alex Robbins, Michael Dykes, Paul Bryden, Sam Yates, Michael Rhodes, Jerry the Meerkat, Heretic, Cameron Jefferson, John M, Andrew Evanson, JM97, Gallifreyan Rob, Cliff's Random Silliness, Kyle McCroy, Nova Wolf Gaming, Carol Jude, Mr. KNL, Autumn Matthews, Josh Rocks 123, The Raggedy Jedi, Upmixed Time Lord. If you want to become a member, feel free to do so. It really helps out. You get exclusive posts, shout outs in every video, and even your own badge and custom emojis to use.